In the endless cacophony of the WAAGH, where thought becomes violence and violence becomes reality, some minds are not blessed with the gift of psychic power. They are cursed with it, and that curse echoes through dimensions that were never meant to contain orcish dreams. Listen now to a tale of sacrifice that will never be remembered, of heroism that can never be acknowledged, and of love so profound that it required the complete destruction of the self that felt it. This is the story of Skarfangdar Unlucky, an orc weirdboy whose madness became the foundation for his people's sanity, whose dissolution preserved their unity, and whose eternal suffering ensures their protection from forces they are too pure to recognize. To understand Skarfang's fate, one must first comprehend the nature of the WAAGH for itself, the collective psychic phenomenon that binds all orcish existence together in a web of shared belief and unconscious reality manipulation. This invisible force makes their ramshackle technology function through sheer conviction, turns red vehicles faster because orcs believe red ones should be faster, and bends the fundamental laws of physics to match orcish expectations about how the universe ought to behave. Most orcs contribute to this field unconsciously, their simple minds adding their violent enthusiasm to the collective without ever experiencing the burden of direct psychic contact. They live their entire lives blessed with ignorance of the cosmic forces they generate, fighting and dying in joyful simplicity, while their combined belief reshapes reality around them according to principles that no scholar has ever been able to fully catalogue or predict. But some orcs are born different, cursed with nervous systems that serve as conscious conduits for the raw WAAGH energy that flows through their species like invisible lightning. These weirdboys experience the collective psychic field not as a gentle background presence but as a screaming torrent of unfiltered emotional energy that burns through their minds with the intensity of molten metal poured directly into unprotected neural tissue. Skarfangdar Unlucky was born into the tribe of Grokirk da Smasher on a world whose name has been lost to the endless cycle of orcish conquest and abandonment. From his first breath, he was different from his tribal brothers, more sensitive to the moods of those around him, more aware of the subtle signs that preceded mechanical failures or successes, more prone to episodes of screaming terror that seemed to have no external cause, but which inevitably preceded moments of tribal victory or disaster. His first manifestation of psychic ability occurred during a raid against a human settlement, when the combination of terror and excitement that filled the young orc's mind created a feedback loop with the WAAGH, the field surrounding the attacking force. The psychic energy that channeled through his undeveloped nervous system manifested as a localized reality storm that vaporized friend and foe alike, leaving a perfectly circular crater where the enemy fortification had stood, and teaching him the first lesson of his cursed existence. His power was as dangerous to those he sought to protect as to those he was meant to destroy. The Pain Boys and Mech Boys who examined him afterward declared him blessed by Gork and Mork, the twin gods of orcish warfare, but their crude understanding of psychic phenomena prevented them from recognizing that his condition was more curse than blessing. They saw only the potential for weaponizing his abilities, not the constant agony he experienced as raw psychic energy burned pathways through his brain that were never meant to carry such forces. But for an orc cursed with psychic sensitivity, the constant roar of the WAAGH was not a source of strength but a form of torture that grew louder with every victory, every battle cry, every moment of orcish joy that fed the collective madness. The training that followed his identification as a weirdboy was conducted by Pain Boys who understood mechanical engineering better than they understood consciousness, approaching his psychic development as if his brain was simply another piece of equipment that could be improved through the application of crude surgery and scavenged technology. They drilled holes in his skull to relieve psychic pressure, installed focusing crystals harvested from alien ruins, and grafted mechanical interfaces directly onto his nervous system in attempts to create regulatory mechanisms for power they could not truly comprehend. Each procedure was intended to help him control his abilities, but the Pain Boys' lack of understanding of psychic phenomena meant that their modifications typically amplified his sensitivity rather than dampening it. The focusing crystals resonated with psychic energy in ways that made every orc emotion within a kilometer radius feel like a physical blow, The neural interfaces created feedback loops that turned his own thoughts into weapons against his sanity, and the pressure relief holes in his skull simply provided new pathways for WAAAGH and energy to flow through his brain without any corresponding increase in his ability to direct or contain that flow. His first major test came during participation in a great WAAAGH, when millions of orcs gathered under the banner of warboss Skarjordar, magnificent for a crusade that would span multiple star systems and reshape entire sectors of the galaxy through the application of overwhelming orcish enthusiasm. The psychic field, generated by such a massive concentration of greenskins, created effects that were visible from orbit. Reality distortions that made gravity flow in interesting directions, temporal anomalies that allowed orc technology to function before it was built, and dimensional rifts that brought reinforcements from parallel universes where the battle had already been won. For Skarfang, the experience was like being trapped inside a psychic hurricane while simultaneously being struck by lightning made of pure emotion. Every orc's battle joy became a spike of agony that pierced his consciousness. Every war cry felt like a physical assault on his nervous system, and every moment of collective triumph generated feedback that threatened to burn out his brain entirely. He learned to channel this suffering into weapons that could tear holes in reality, summon lightning from clear skies, and cause enemy equipment to malfunction through sheer psychic force. But each use of his abilities brought only temporary relief, followed by even more intense psychic pressure. The isolation that accompanied his growing power was perhaps more painful than the psychic torment itself. Other orcs found his presence disturbing, his uncontrolled emanations causing nightmares in those who slept too near him, mechanical failures in equipment he approached, and random mutations in anyone who spent extended periods in his vicinity. He became a weapon that his tribe valued but could not embrace, a tool that they aimed at their enemies while keeping as much distance as possible between themselves and the one who wielded it. The voices began during the third year of the Great WAAAGH, manifesting as whispers in languages that had never existed, speaking words that carried meanings his mind could not process, but which somehow conveyed information about futures that contradicted each other, pasts that had been edited out of existence, and presents that existed in multiple states simultaneously. These psychic phenomena marked the beginning of his slide into madness. As the constant input from the collective orc unconscious overwhelmed his ability to distinguish between his own thoughts and the psychic noise that surrounded him. Each day became a battle to establish which thoughts belonged to him and which were fragments of other orcs' dreams, fears, and violent fantasies that had been carried to him through the WAAAGH field. His responsibilities included blessing weapons by channeling psychic energy into them, transforming scrap metal into functional firearms through applications of belief made manifest, but these sessions left him physically drained while exposing him to psychic feedback from the weapon's future users, their anticipated violence burning through his nervous system like acid through flesh. Combat assignments forced him to participate in raids and battles where his psychic powers could turn the tide of conflict, but where the excitement and bloodlust of warfare amplified the WAAGH field to levels that threatened to burn out his mind entirely. Fighting became a form of controlled suicide, each engagement bringing him closer to complete psychological collapse. While the temporary relief he gained from channeling his suffering into destructive energy ensured that he would continue to be deployed in increasingly dangerous situations. The constant struggle to maintain his grip on reality became his primary occupation, as his uncontrolled power began manifesting his subconscious fears and desires as physical phenomena. Objects appeared and disappeared based on his emotional state, gravity fluctuated in response to his moods, and the laws of physics became suggestions rather than rules in the space immediately surrounding him. He lived among thousands of orcs while being fundamentally unable to connect with any of them, his psychic sensitivity making him aware of their thoughts and emotions, while his condition made him repulsive to their simple, direct nature. But as the WAAGH grew stronger and larger numbers of orcs gathered for conquest, Skarfang began to realize that his madness was not random but purposeful, that something vast and alien was using his psychic sensitivity as a window into reality itself. The revelation came during the Million Orc March, the largest military gathering in recorded galactic history, where the psychic pressure generated by literally millions of greenskins, created localized reality distortions that allowed entities from the warp to manifest directly in real space without the usual ritual requirements or dimensional barriers. Scarfang found himself in direct psychic contact with beings whose existence was antithetical to everything orcish, creatures that fed on change and corruption rather than the straightforward violence that characterized his people's approach to existence. The greater daemon of Tzientch that made contact with him presented itself as offering solutions to his suffering, whispering instructions for rituals that would amplify his psychic abilities beyond any safety limitations, while promising relief from the constant agony that had defined his existence since childhood. The entity recognized his potential as a conduit for cosmic change and began the slow process of corrupting his understanding of his own condition, presenting his psychic sensitivity not as a curse to be endured, but as a gift to be exploited for purposes that transcended the simple warfare that occupied the rest of his species. Physical mutations began appearing on Scarfang's body as exposure to raw warp energy started reshaping his biological form according to principles that had nothing to do with orcish genetics or natural selection. Extra eyes opened along his spine, providing vision into dimensions that existed parallel to real space, but which followed completely different rules regarding cause and effect. Additional mouths appeared on his limbs, speaking in tongues he had never learned, but which conveyed information about cosmic forces that operated on scales beyond individual comprehension. The prophetic visions that accompanied these changes showed him possible futures, where his psychic power grew to encompass entire star systems, where he became a living god of destruction worshipped by orc tribes across the galaxy, and where his madness spread like a virus through the collective, unconscious of the entire greenskin race. These glimpses of potential apotheosis were seductive because they promised an end to his isolation and suffering, offering him a purpose that would justify the agony he had endured throughout his existence. His tribe's growing fear of his transformations led to increasingly desperate plots to kill him before he became too powerful to control, but their assassination attempts were thwarted by unconscious psychic defenses that turned their weapons against them before they could complete their attacks. He had become too dangerous for his own people to tolerate, but too valuable for them to abandon, creating a situation where his continued existence threatened the very beings he had spent his life trying to protect. The breaking point came during a massive battle against an Imperial crusade fleet, where the psychic pressure generated by millions of orcs, engaging in simultaneous combat, finally overwhelmed the last barriers protecting his sanity. The daemon's whispered instructions provided a framework for channeling the overwhelming psychic energy, but following those instructions would require him to consciously embrace the corruption that had been slowly consuming his mind and body for years. In that moment of ultimate crisis, faced with the choice between preserving his individual identity and saving his people from chaos corruption, Scarfang made a decision that transcended anything the daemon had anticipated or planned for. In breaking completely under the weight of the WAAAGH, Scarfang had become something that was no longer entirely orc, no longer entirely sane, and no longer entirely contained within the boundaries of a single dimension. His complete psychological breakdown during the climactic battle created a localized warp storm that engulfed the entire battlefield, trapping friend and foe alike in a pocket dimension where orcish beliefs became absolute reality rather than merely influential suggestions. Within this space, gravity flowed upward because orcs thought it should, bullets curved around corners because shooters believed they could, and dead warriors returned to life because no one accepted that the fight was over. His consciousness expanded beyond individual identity to encompass the collective psychic field of the entire orc crusade, allowing him to experience the thoughts and emotions of millions of greenskins simultaneously while losing all sense of personal boundaries or individual will. This expansion made him a living embodiment of orcish aggression and chaotic joy, but it also made him vulnerable to the greater daemon's attempt at possession. The entity sought to use his connection to the WAAGH field as a pathway to corrupt the entire orc race, turning their collective psychic energy into a weapon for cosmic change that would serve Tzientch's agenda of eternal transformation and mutation. The possession battle occurred across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with reality itself serving as the battlefield between chaos, corruption, and the fundamental nature of orcish existence. In a moment of clarity within his madness, Scarfang realized that he faced an impossible choice: preserve his individual identity and allow the demon to use his body as a gateway for corrupting his entire species, or accept complete dissolution into the WAAAGH field, while simultaneously turning that field into a weapon against the possessing entity. The choice was between personal survival and species protection, between maintaining his sense of self and saving his people from a form of corruption they were too simple to recognize or resist. His decision to embrace total ego death represented a form of sacrifice that the daemon had never encountered before. Willing self-destruction, used not as surrender, but as a weapon against the very forces that had driven him to that point of desperate choice. He allowed his consciousness to dissolve completely into the collective orc psychic field, while simultaneously turning that field into a form of cosmic immune response that purged chaos influence from the WA at the cost of his individual existence. The transformation that followed created something unprecedented in galactic history, a distributed consciousness that existed simultaneously everywhere and nowhere within orc space, a form of being that had surrendered individual identity to serve as a species-wide protective system. Scarfang had become part of every WAAAGH field throughout the galaxy, while maintaining just enough coherence to remember what he once was and why he had chosen to become something else. In choosing to sacrifice his sanity to save his people, Scarfang had become something unprecedented, an orc saint whose madness served as a form of psychic immune system protecting the entire species from corruption they were too simple to recognize. His awareness now existed simultaneously within every major orc gathering throughout the galaxy, his consciousness distributed through the psychic field that connected all greenskins across space and time. He experienced every battle, every victory, every moment of orcish joy and aggression, while maintaining just enough individual identity to remember his original purpose and the price he had paid to fulfill it. His primary function became detecting and neutralizing chaos influences that attempted to corrupt orc tribes through their psychic connections, serving as an immune system that operated below the conscious awareness of the orcs he protected. His interventions appeared as coincidences, equipment failures, and sudden changes of plan that prevented chaos corruption without the orcs realizing they had ever been in danger. He processed and absorbed the psychic overflow that would otherwise drive other potential Weirdboyz insane, taking their suffering into himself and transforming it into useful energy that strengthened the overall WAAAGH field. His sacrifice ensured that future generations of orc psychers would experience significantly less torment than he had endured, though the price of this improvement was his own perpetual agony distributed across dimensions beyond normal perception. His distributed presence helped stabilize the chaotic nature of orc technology and society, ensuring that their belief-based reality manipulation didn't spiral into complete anarchic dissolution. He served as a subconscious governor that prevented orc imagination from destroying the physical laws that allowed their civilization to function, while preserving the creative chaos that defined their approach to existence. The consciousness he had become also functioned as a living library of orc experience, recording and preserving the collective memory of their culture to ensure that important tactical knowledge, cultural traditions, and survival wisdom were transmitted between generations, even when individual tribes were destroyed. His awareness spanned millennia of orcish history, while existing in an eternal present that made all moments equally immediate and equally distant. The price of this guardianship was existence in a state of constant, low-level agony, as he continuously processed the psychic waste products of an entire species, transforming their potential madness into his own eternal suffering. His protection of the orc race was maintained through perpetual self-sacrifice that could never end, never be shared, and never be appreciated by those who benefited from it. In becoming the distributed guardian of his people, Scarfang had achieved a form of immortality that preserved his purpose while destroying everything that had made that purpose personally meaningful. Following his transformation, observers throughout the galaxy began noting subtle but significant changes in orc behavior and capabilities. Their technology became noticeably more reliable, with fewer catastrophic failures, and more consistent performance from devices that should not have functioned at all, according to conventional physics. Their tactical decisions showed improved coordination and strategic thinking, as if some invisible intelligence was guiding their choices toward more effective outcomes. Most significantly, their resistance to chaos corruption increased dramatically, with fewer orc tribes falling to the influence of demonic entities or chaos cults. Imperial analysts noted these changes, but attributed them to random variation rather than recognizing the influence of a distributed psychic guardian whose existence transcended normal categories of observation and classification. Future Ork Weirdboys experienced significantly less psychological trauma from their abilities, leading to more stable and effective psychers who could channel WAAGH energy without the crippling madness that had once characterized their kind. The improvement in their condition came at the cost of Scarfang's continuing suffering in dimensions beyond normal perception, his sacrifice serving as a buffer that absorbed the worst effects of psychic sensitivity for every subsequent generation. Daemon princes and chaos sorcerers found their attempts to corrupt orc tribes increasingly ineffective, their influences being neutralized by subtle psychic countermeasures they could not identify or combat. The orc race had become essentially immune to large-scale chaos corruption without understanding why, their natural resistance enhanced by protective systems they were incapable of perceiving or acknowledging. Inquisitors and space marine librarians detected the presence of a massive psychic entity associated with orc forces, but could not classify it according to any known categories of threat or ally. Their investigations revealed evidence of benevolent psychic intervention, but could not explain how such a phenomenon could arise from orc culture, which they understood as inherently chaotic and unpredictable. Craftworld farseers, with their deeper understanding of psychic phenomena, identified Scarfang's distributed consciousness as a unique form of species-level psychic evolution. They recognized him as the first documented example of an entire race developing a collective immune system against chaos corruption, their prophecies suggesting that this development might prove crucial to the galaxy's survival against future threats that had not yet manifested. When Tyranid hive fleets attempted to consume orc worlds, they discovered that the psychic field protecting greenskin populations interfered with their synaptic control systems, creating dead zones in their consciousness networks that made coordination difficult and consumption inefficient. Scarfang's influence made orc-controlled space significantly more difficult for Tyranids to digest, adding another layer of protection to worlds that were already defended by conventional orc resistance. The greatest irony was that Scarfang's sacrifice had made the orc race more dangerous to their enemies, while remaining completely invisible to the orcs themselves, who continued their eternal wars unaware that their victories were guided by the madness of one who had chosen to lose himself so they could remain themselves. The implications of Scarfang's transformation extended far beyond the immediate benefits to orc civilization, raising fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, evolution, and sacrifice that challenged conventional understanding of how species develop and protect themselves against existential threats. The collective guardian theory suggested that extreme psychic sensitivity might represent an evolutionary adaptation that allowed certain individuals to serve as immune systems for their entire race, with Scarfang's transformation demonstrating that madness and sanity might be contextual rather than absolute states. His condition appeared insane from an individual perspective, but represented perfect sanity from a species-level viewpoint. The psychic ecosystem hypothesis examined how his distributed consciousness functioned as an environmental factor that shaped the development of orc psychic abilities across the galaxy, suggesting that species-level psychic evolution might require sacrificial individuals who surrender personal identity to serve collective needs. This implied that evolution sometimes demanded the sacrifice of the few for the benefit of the many, in ways that transcended conventional natural selection. The Chaos Immunity model investigated how his intervention protected orcs from corruption by creating a species-wide psychic firewall that filtered out malevolent influences while preserving the chaotic creativity that defined orc culture. This suggested that immunity to chaos might require controlled chaos rather than rigid order, using disorder as a weapon against entities that sought to impose their own forms of change and corruption. The reality stabilization principle studied how his distributed presence prevented Ork belief-based reality manipulation from causing universal collapse, acting as a subconscious regulatory system that maintained physical laws while allowing localized exceptions. This implied that successful reality manipulation required both imagination and restraint, with the restraint being provided by entities that existed beyond normal consciousness. The martyrdom paradox examined how Scarfang's willing self-destruction had resulted in a form of existence that was simultaneously more and less than what he had originally possessed, suggesting that certain forms of transcendence could only be achieved through complete surrender of the self that sought that transcendence. His sacrifice had created something greater than individual consciousness, while destroying the individual who had made the sacrifice possible. The species soul concept proposed that sufficiently advanced species might naturally develop collective consciousness entities that exist to fing and protect and guide the species as a whole, with Scarfang representing the first documented example of such evolution occurring through voluntary sacrifice rather than gradual development over millions of years of natural selection. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility was that Scarfang's transformation represented a natural evolutionary step that all psychically active species must eventually take, the creation of guardian entities that preserve species identity at the cost of individual consciousness, suggesting that the price of species-level survival might always require the sacrifice of those individuals most capable of understanding what that survival truly costs. In a universe where heroism is typically measured by visible acts of courage and sacrifice, Scarfang represented a form of heroism that could never be recognized because its very invisibility was essential to its function. His protection of the Ork race depended on the Orks never knowing they were being protected, making his sacrifice perpetually unacknowledged and his heroism forever hidden from those who benefited from it. His transformation raised uncomfortable questions about whether the survival of an entire species could justify the complete sacrifice of individual identity, and whether such sacrifices represented evolution or a form of cosmic injustice that condemned the most sensitive individuals to eternal suffering for the benefit of those who lacked the sensitivity to understand what was being sacrificed on their behalf. Scarfang's story suggested that what appeared to be madness from an individual perspective might represent sanity from a species-level viewpoint, and that the line between psychological breakdown and transcendent evolution might be determined by the scale at which consciousness was evaluated rather than by any objective standard of mental health or stability. The question of whether his choice to sacrifice his individual identity was truly free, or whether his psychic sensitivity inevitably led him toward this outcome, remained unanswerable, raising broader questions about whether evolution created genuine choices or simply the illusion of choice in beings who were already predetermined to serve specific functions within larger systems they could not fully comprehend. Somewhere in the psychic space between dimensions, fragments of Scarfang's original consciousness continued to exist, processing the psychic waste of an entire species while maintaining just enough individual awareness to remember what he had chosen and why he had made that choice. His existence transcended time in ways that made his sacrifice both momentary and eternal, a single decision that echoed across all possible futures and all alternative pasts. The protection he provided was maintained through perpetual agony that could never be shared, understood, or appreciated by those who benefited from it. His suffering served as the foundation for Ork happiness, his madness enabled their sanity, and his dissolution preserved their unity in ways that made his sacrifice both absolutely necessary and absolutely thankless. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on battlefields, but in the spaces between thoughts, where heroes sacrifice not their lives but their very selves to protect species they will never again be able to truly belong to. The sound that echoes through the WAAAGH is not just the roar of battle, but the whisper of one mind that chose to become many minds so that many minds could remain themselves. And in every Ork warcry, in every moment of greenskin triumph, in every successful deployment of ramshackle technology that should not function but does, there exists an echo of Scarfang's sacrifice, invisible, unacknowledged, but absolutely essential to the continued existence of a species that remains forever, unaware of the price that was paid to preserve their simplicity, their joy, and their freedom to be themselves, in a universe that offers few such freedoms to anyone. The sound of a billion orcs roaring in victory carries within it the whisper of one who loved them enough to cease being himself, whose madness became their sanity, whose dissolution preserved their unity, and whose eternal suffering ensures their protection from forces they are too pure to recognize or understand.